have my friend and godbrother of 50 years be with us tonight, and also to my E and Rick playing for us. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. I don't have the script in front of me, but Harvard educated. You can throw more things out, those of you that know the script. Very dedicated to the mission of our spiritual masters of the Prabhupada, to spread consciousness all over the world. So he's here in Ashland with us. Appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Since I think almost everybody here knows something about yoga, I'm going to read a beautiful verse from the Bhagavad Gita in which Krishna explains who the greatest yogi is. Actually, there's a few places where he does that, but this one is interesting. So, this is, excuse me, chapter 6, text 32. First, I'll read the Sanskrit. Atmopanyena sarvatra samang pashyati jorjuna sukham va yadi va dukam sadyogi paramo mataha. So the last line is sadyogi, that yogi, paramo mataha. Mataha means is considered paramo, the highest yogi. So let's see what the qualifications are to be the highest yogi. I'll just mention a word on the relationship between the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. In the Bhagavad Gita, first actually in chapter 2, and then again in chapter 3, and again in chapter 5, Krishna introduces two words, which are Sankhya and Yoga. And in the context in which Krishna is using these words, Sankhya and Yoga mean very much philosophy and practice. Philosophy and practice. And Krishna says that Sankhya Yoga, chapter 5, Sankhya Yoga pratab bala pravadanti napandita ekamapi asitak samyak ubhayor vindate phalam. So Krishna says Sankhya Yoga, philosophy and practice, that people who are bala, which literally means children, it's sort of a way in Sanskrit of saying immature. You say children. So Sankhya Yoga pratab bala pravadanti. Pravadanti means claim. People who are bala, who are sort of immature in this knowledge, they claim that philosophy and practice are different. Sankhya Yoga pratab means different. Sankhya Yoga pratab bala pravadanti, but na pandita. The wise don't say that. This, of course, is the word pandita, which now in English can mean someone that knows a lot about, soccer or anything. The word pandit now has become an English word, but originally in Sanskrit, of course, it means a wise person. So, but the wise, the panditas, do not say that philosophy and practice are different. Why? Because ekamapi astitak samyak. Because if one can practice even one of them, or actually asta almost means like really stick to it. If one can practice or really stick to even one of them, ubhayor vindate phalam, one achieves the fruit, the result of both. And of course, so keeping that in mind, well, what I wanted to say is that, so if you look at Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras, which also mention Sankhya, also mention philosophy, but they are really to a great extent, focusing, Yoga Sutras focus on yoga, the practice, the actual practice of self-realization. Whereas the Bhagavad Gita, which also mentions, describes briefly, you could say, Ashtanga Yoga, but the Bhagavad Gita is really focusing on the philosophy. So that's the relationship between these two books. So from a philosophical sense, to get a clear, rational understanding of what's all this about, then the Bhagavad Gita is the primary text. So in this verse, which I've chosen today, or Krishna says that yogi is considered the highest. So what are the qualifications? How did that yogi get the gold medal? So Krishna says, Atmopam yena sarvatra samang pashyati Arjuna. So that yogi is one who sees in a particular way. Pashyati means that person sees. In my Gita guide, which is here, actually the rest of this class will be an infomercial. Just kidding. So I actually point out that in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna very often talks about knowledge as a way of seeing, or in other words, if you really know something, you actually see it. And in fact, in the Vedas, the oldest Sanskrit literature, going back to very ancient times, the sages are called rishis, and that's often translated, has been translated even by Western translators as seer. So Krishna is constantly talking about knowing as seeing. If you know something, you really see it. So here Krishna talks about something that the greatest yogi sees. And what the greatest yogi sees, now I'll just first tell you, and then I'll go into some of the Sanskrit because it's very interesting. The greatest yogi sees everywhere with universal empathy. Universal empathy, because self-realization, it's like you can't just do your self-realization and not see everyone else as an Atma, an eternal self, as much as you see yourself that way, because it's like if the lights are on, you can not only see your own hand, you can see everybody else's hand. So either the lights are on or off. And if the lights are on, then you see everyone as an eternal spiritual being. And of course, that leads to a very powerful, a very profound empathy. Because although there are individual souls, according to the Bhagavad Gita, there are individual souls, but they're both one and different. They're not merely different. If you consider, for example, in this world, so you just see someone in the street or in a supermarket, and you understand that person is anatomically human and probably in some ways is similar to you. However, there's no real emotional connection. It's just someone you pass by in the street or somewhere else. Whereas if you see a long lost friend, or if you see someone who's actually a member of your family, then your response is different. There's a oneness, there's a strong connection. Or if you see your wife or husband or your child and so on. And so we can understand that even in ordinary material consciousness, there are different levels of empathy. There are different levels of empathy. So let's look at what Krishna actually says, because I've always been inspired by looking very closely at the actual Sanskrit words that Krishna uses, because we can translate them, but almost always there's a lot more in the word than can be expressed just by one word-to-word translation. So this begins with Atmopamya, which Krishna here gives in the instrumental case, Atmopamyena. So the word opamya in Sanskrit means comparison, and it comes from the word upama. Ma in Sanskrit is the verb to measure. That's, in fact, bless you. In fact, for example, we have words like metric or measure. That's Sanskrit. It's Sanskrit matra. Matra becomes metric in English. matra, and so the measure of something. So and the verb from which it comes is ma. So upama means, and upa, which we also have in English, by the way, upa, which means near. It can mean like near but not quite there. Like, for example, there's a Sanskrit genre of literature called Puranas, and so there are the main Puranas, and then there are what is called the Upa Puranas, the junior Puranas. So Upa can mean either something which is not quite there. Oh, is it possible to do that later in the whatever's going on up there? So, the word upa came through Greek to English. In the Greek, they added a silent H in front of it, which is not pronounced, and then so it became the Greek hypo. I mean, we pronounce the H. And so, like for example, hypothermia. Hypothermia means not enough heat. It's like, it's not there yet. So hypothermia, hypo this, hypo that. So that word hypo is actually Sanskrit upa. And so upa ma means that it can also mean to be close to something, to approach something. And so when you bring two things together to measure them, that's called upama in Sanskrit. And so then, bless you. So from the word upama, you have the word, and so then opamya, which means the process of measuring two things together, bringing two things together and comparing them. And so what Krishna says here is that what you're actually measuring here is the Atma, the self. So atmopamyena means that you're actually comparing yourself to other selves. You're comparing yourself as a conscious being, as a self, as a soul, to other souls, to other selves. And Krishna says, so atmopamyena, by that process of comparing yourself to other selves, sarvatra, everywhere, not just people you like, but everywhere, comparing yourself to other selves. So atmopamyena sarvatra, and what's the result? Samang pashyati, that a person sees that we're all equal. A person sees that actually we are all equal. Atmopamyena sarvatra samang pashyati, Arjuna. One who sees that equality everywhere. Sukham va jadi va dukkam. Sukha means happiness, because some people are happy, some people are unhappy. People are in all different situations in life. And so sukham va jadi va dukkam, which means whether people are happy or indeed if they're unhappy. In other words, in all different conditions, if you see that there's an equality between all souls, then Krishna says, Sad Yogi, that yogi, Paramo Mata, is considered the greatest. Because you can imagine a yogi who simply focuses on their own happiness or just their own self-realization and is not really concerned with others. And that is not the advanced yogi. In fact, if I don't see other people as spiritual beings, I'm not really seeing myself that way either. I may have like some flash or some mystic experience or whatever I'm doing. But if I'm not seeing everyone else equally an eternal being, then I haven't really understood myself as an eternal being. So this atmopamyena sarvatra, these three words, really you could translate pretty literally as a universal empathy. And so therefore, if you look at they have the same idea, by the way, in Buddhism, the notion of the bodhisattva, the idea that someone who's really there, someone who actually has achieved higher consciousness, actually cares about other people. So, and if you care about other people, you try to help them. It's like if a mother has children, you care about them. If they need help, you actually help them. You can't just say, well, I care about you, but I've got a lot of things on my plate right now. So, so that's what Krishna says about the greatest yogi. And another important point here is Sarvatra. Sarvatra also includes God, which some people have an allergic reaction to, but still, it's there in the Yoga Sutras, and it's also there in the Bhagavad Gita. From my point of view, if someone, and of course, God doesn't mean the Christian God, the Hindu God, it doesn't mean the Muslim, that just means we're speaking here philosophically, not in terms of any particular sectarian religion. So, because one point that I've made is there is tribal monotheism, and there's philosophical monotheism. Tribal monotheism is basically my God can beat up your God, or my God exists and your God is just a figment of your imagination. All these like very flattering ideas, but so we're not talking about tribal monotheism as a philosophical point. In fact, I would make the point that unless one, in a philosophical sense, not in a sectarian sense or dogmatic sense, but unless one is actually trying to understand God in the Vedanta sense, a person has basically abandoned the main project of human life, which is to use our intelligence to try to find the truth, capital T, if we're allowed to say it anymore. So the point here is that if you look at the process of reasoning, if you just think about how intelligence works, intelligence basically works through processes like categorizing. For example, let's say you see a horse and you see another horse, you see a third horse, and it just never occurred to you they're the same species. You see three horses. This, by the way, this is very much Greek philosophy. They stayed up nights talking about things like this, ancient Greek philosophy. So if you see three horses and you don't get the idea that there's a category or a species, or maybe, subspecies, different kinds of horses, there's not going to be anything like horse science. Or now another thing about seeing categories, so the ability to see categories and not just, because if you saw, in one sense you could say that there's kind of this sort of exciting LSD way to see things where everything you see is like you're seeing as if for the first time. So, but that doesn't rule out actually seeing like this is a car and there are other cars, or this is a cat and there are other cats. There are categories. And then the other thing you have to be able to do to reason is causality. A causes B or B causes C. Because if you didn't do that, for one thing, you could not safely feed yourself. Because let's say you ate something and had an allergic reaction, and the next time that same food is offered to you, you just don't remember that you had an allergic reaction. Or the last time you say you tried to jump across a crevice, you fell and broke half your bones, but you don't remember that, you try to jump again. I mean, it's pretty obvious that you could not be a functional, rational human being unless you're able to see categories and causality through memory, because memory, it recalls what causes what. So these are the things we have to do. So ultimately, what the rational mind does, and this is done in science as well as philosophy, this is called rational. And that is, you try to find out, if I'm doing causality, if I'm looking like what causes what in this world, what is an ultimate cause? Because we see in this world so many things cause so many other things. Everything is interacting in this world on a physical level, on a psychological level. I mean, on many, many levels, everything is we live in an extremely interactive universe in which things are affecting each other. So if you ask the question, what's the ultimate cause of all this? Where did it come from? And two famous books that talk about this are Vedanta Sutra and the works of Aristotle. Because so you could say, well, why bother with the God thing, or why bother with the first cause? Because if you're not interested in the first cause, a person is just not serious about understanding. For example, take cosmology. We can study galaxies and, star formation and planets and all that stuff. But ultimately, scientists ask the big question, where did it come from? So you can go with the Big Bang, or in one of its, many modified versions. That's a whole other topic. It's a whole other topic, the Big Bang and how they approach that. But if you look at cosmology, like, where did the universe come from? And so why is it important to ask the big questions? Like Vedanta begins with the words Janmadhyasya Jataha. Janmadhyasya. That the absolute, because Vedanta, you've heard of Vedanta. The Vedanta Sutras are basically trying to understand the Upanishads, which is sort of this mystic philosophical literature, one branch of the Vedas. And so in the Upanishads, we find a key term, which is perhaps the most important term in the Upanishads, which is Brahman, which means the absolute truth. And so the Upanishads are a series of texts that are trying to understand what is that absolute of the Upanishads. What is it? And so then in Vedanta, which in itself is a commentary on the Upanishads, because there are many Vedanta commentaries, but the Brahma Sutras, Vedanta Sutra itself is a commentary on the Upanishads. And so it begins, it's very interesting. The Vedanta begins in this very interesting way. The first sutra, by the way, the word sutra in Sanskrit is cognate with, linguistically related to the English word suture or sew, because sutra actually means thread. It's just like when I was a kid, they had the TV show called Dragnet with Professor Sergeant Friday and yeah. And so his assistant would always say, "Just the facts, ma'am." So that's kind of like the sutras, just the facts. Because when you think about it, the thread of something is just the bare essentials without elaboration. So so Vedanta Sutras just means the Vedanta threads. And so it's a category, it's a genre of literature. There's all kinds of sutras. There's Karma Sutras, or Dharma Sutras, there are Vedanta Sutras. And so it's a genre of literature. And ultimately, the highest literature in that genre is the Brahma Sutra, the sutras that describe the absolute, or also called Vedanta, the end of knowledge. So it begins by saying, Atato Brahma Jigyasa. You've probably heard that. So Atato is just ato, which simply means in Sanskrit, now therefore. So ataha. So when you begin a book by saying therefore, that should make you stop and think. Because therefore, or in this case, ataha, there are various ways you can say therefore in Sanskrit, but the common way is ataha, which literally means from this. It should make people think, because therefore is something you say at the end of an argument, not the beginning. Like you say, okay, given this, given that, given the other thing, therefore. So how can you begin a book with the word therefore?
Wow.
So that's the first interesting point about Vedanta. Now, therefore, so the way the acharyas, the great teachers, explain this is that the Brahma Sutras or Vedanta Sutras are announcing that this is for people who have already figured out the obvious, that you're never going to be fully happy or enlightened in material life. And if someone is still thinking that, wish them well, but they're not really ready for this literature. So specifically for people, it's not, doesn't mean people who are suicidal or depressed or cynical. No, people who are, they can be good, happy, intelligent people, but they've just figured out that I'm not ultimately going to be happy in ordinary material life. Therefore, so now, therefore, because you've understood that, Brahma Jigyasa. Jigyasa, these are very interesting words. Brahman, I've already explained, the absolute. Jigyasa is I'll just tell you straight. It's a desiderative singular noun formed from the Sanskrit root gya, which means to know. And there are traces of it in Greek, like Gnosticism. The Greek word Gnostic, which literally meant like a knower. Gnostic comes from jnana. And agnostic means one who doesn't know. That's agnostic. In other words, an agyani in Sanskrit. So jigyasa means the desire to know. Now, therefore, the desire to know the absolute. Because relative truths are just that. They're relative. Here today, gone tomorrow. So therefore, now that you've understood that the ultimate knowledge is not relative, it's an absolute truth, now therefore, the desire to know it, which means like the investigation into or the search for absolute truth. So, so that's the first sutra. That's the first sutra. And the next sutra defines what Brahman actually is by saying that Janma Dyasya Jataha. It is that from which everything emanates. And literally birth, Janma, from the Sanskrit root jan, which of course we still have in English, in words like generate. So the absolute is Janma Adi. Adi in Sanskrit means, I hope you don't mind if I actually explain all the words. Adi in Sanskrit means the first or the original, like Govinda Adi Purusham, Govinda, the original person. So it's very common in Sanskrit to use the word Adi as the equivalent of etc. Because when you put Adi after a word like Janmadi, it means a group of things whose first member is Janma. So that's how it's used. So, I mean, there are innumerable little compounds in Sanskrit literature, you'll notice, that have Adi at the end of them in a compound. And that's what it means. It means a well-known group of things whose first member, Adi, is Janma, in this case. And so what is the well-known group of things whose first member is Janma? Wow. Mood music. So that well-known group is Janma, Stiti Pralaya, and then there are different words, which means birth, maintenance, and perishing. Because in this world, everything begins, it goes on for a while, and then it ends. That's the nature of everything in this world. In fact, So that's a problem. Because there are things in this world we actually like. Like, for example, being alive. Or we like our families, unless we get some really bad family karma. I mean, most people like their families. And or just the beautiful things, like, like there's that song, famous song from the 60s, "Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end." And so when we have those moments where we experience love and happiness and beauty, we don't want them to vanish, but they do. And so, in a sense, this Janmadi, and then the next word is Asya. This is a very interesting word. Asya means of this, literally. It means of this, the birth, etc., of this. And so Sanskrit, in Sanskrit, in philosophical Sanskrit and intellectual Sanskrit, I mean, going way back, they placed a high premium on brevity. In other words, if you can say something in 3 words and you say it in 9 words, you're not thinking clearly. So they really placed emphasis on succinctness, brevity, saying things. So if you in Sanskrit, there are three grades of neuter pronouns or even gendered pronouns. Like, for example, this, that, and the farther one. Exactly as in Spanish. Esto, eso, y aquello. Right? So they still have that in Sanskrit. Esto, eso. And actually all the Latin languages have those 3. So in Sanskrit, in the neuter, it would be idam, means this, that which is closest to you. Idam, and then tat, like on tasa, that. So idam, this, tat, that, and then aso, which means the farther one. Anyway, so in philosophical Sanskrit, since idam is this, that which is closest to you, so what is closest to us? The material world. Because it's what we're experiencing directly. Therefore, in philosophical Sanskrit, you can just say idam, and it means the material world, this. And perhaps the most famous example of using the word idam like that is the beginning of the Upanishad, Om Purnamada Purnamidam. And so Ada is the farther one, like that is complete, this is complete. So Purnamidam means this world is complete. Now, Sanskrit is a inflected language, which I'm sure is going to make your day just hearing that. Inflected language, and English used to be an inflected language, means that rather than using prepositions like I go to the store, or I come from the store, or I go with my friend, or I gave it to her, we use words like to, with, from, besides, and so on. In Sanskrit, you express all those relationships by putting an ending on the word. So, for example, Krishnena, with Krishna, or Krishnaya, unto Krishna, like the monk Krishnaya. Krishnaya means unto Krishna, Krishna, from Krishna, Krishnasya, of Krishna, Krishne, in Krishna, and so on. So the genitive form, meaning like of, for idam is asya. So janmadi, birth, etc., asya, of this, meaning of everything that you've ever experienced. Janmadyasya jataha, from which. So that's the definition of Brahman. First, that now then, let's talk about absolute truth, not relative truth. What is the absolute truth? It's that from which everything that you've experienced emanates, by whom it's maintained, and in whom ultimately it comes to rest. So that's the beginning of Vedanta. It's nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, so getting back to my point, that if someone is not interested in knowing where everything comes from, and obviously, unless you know where you come from, you can't really know who you are. It's a very common thing in psychology. Whoops, actually, I'm going to turn the sound off my phone. I was lucky. Nothing happened, but. For example, it's very common in psychology, and actually Freud introduced this. I mean, he was, apart from his demonic attack on spirituality, he understood certain things about psychology. So Freud brought up the point that right now we are experiencing some things, but the reason we feel a certain way, we have certain emotions, fears, or anger, or desires, it goes back to where we come from. What's that? To our childhood, for example. And if you are into serious yoga, then it goes back beyond your childhood to your samskaras, your previous experiences and other lives. But still, thank you. I have a service contract with Panchali. So it's so that's the idea. That unless and so where do you ultimately come from? Let's say you're interested, okay, my childhood was like this or that, and therefore I came out in this way. But I can go deeper through meditation. I can sort of recover certain samskaras, certain experiences, even from past lives. But we're still just skimming the surface. Where did you really come from? And then you've got to go to Vedanta, Janmadhyasa. Where you really came from is from the absolute truth. And if you are yourself merely a relative truth, that means your future is not looking very bright because you just relatively exist. If you exist forever, as Krishna says, you've always existed and always will exist, then you're not just a relative being. If you are a relative being, then the light's going to go out forever, which is pretty awful. I mean, it's like the worst possible outcome. If you value life, this is one point I've made many times. And some people, they kind of do this bravado thing, like, yeah, I don't care about dying, doesn't bother me. But the point is that if you don't value the loss of something, it logically means you don't value having it. Because it's just logically not possible that you value having something, but don't place a negative value on losing it. Like if you say, yeah, I lost my basketball, but I don't care. I wasn't playing very much anyway. So that means the basketball wasn't so important to you, so it wasn't a big deal to lose it. But would a loving mother say, yeah, I went to the mall yesterday and I lost one of my kids. I have no idea where the kid is, but no biggie. It's not a big deal. So when you say that you don't mind losing something, that means you don't really care about having it. But people who really value life, people who love themselves, who love other people, who love life, for them, they understand that it's an unthinkable horror to stop existing. If you really know what life is. And so therefore, the question is, where do I come from? And who am I really? So if someone's not asking these questions, in my view, they're not really very serious about life yet. And they're certainly not philosophical. So when you get these sort of, academic philosophers, say, I'm an atheist or I don't care. I mean, it's just, first of all, it's a bluff. Because when you come to the end of life, They do cure, actually. In fact, there's one famous philosopher who wrote a book because he spent his whole career preaching atheism. Then when he got a terminal illness, he had this super whoops moment. And he realized that big mistake. Anyway, so now I'm going to bring in Aristotle, Prabhu. Aristotle has a very famous argument, probably the first such argument. It's a category of argument for the existence of God. It's a very powerful argument, first made by Aristotle, who's not the most religious guy in Greece. But he just understood logically that it must be a God. And this is the way he reasoned to that conclusion. It's in modern times, it's also called the argument from contingency or dependence. Aristotle, who was the father of modern logic, he kind of invented formal logic in the Western world. He said that we live in a world in which everything that we've ever seen, every material thing we've ever seen, is contingent. And by that he meant it depends on something else for its existence. For example, I have a human body because my parents begot this body. Or for example, this house exists as a house because, someone cut some trees down and made some lumber, and there was a glass factory and they heated sand and water and made glass and a lot of other things. So every item in this room, including the walls and the ceiling and the fan, everything in this room was made from other things. So nothing in this room, talking about the physical objects, existed by itself. It was caused by some other material thing. And so therefore, if you study the material universe, you just have this chain of cause and effect. So Aristotle noticed that, well, why does anything exist? How could anything exist? Because if everything depends on something else, why isn't it the case that nothing exists, that nothing ever came to exist? Because nothing can exist on its own. So how could the first thing have come to exist if nothing in this universe exists by itself? How could the first thing come to exist? He concluded it could not. And therefore, he said, there must be an ultimate cause which has no cause. And because that, which he called God. So because that ultimate entity is not caused by anything else, it just exists by itself. And Aristotle also called that very famously the unmoved mover. The unmoved mover. That which moves everything, but is not moved by anything. And of course, you find this very nice Aristotelian philosophy in the Brahma Samhita, in the first verse. Ishvara Parama Krishna, Satchidananda Vigraha, Anadir Adir, Govinda. There you have it, Aristotle's argument. That Krishna, Ishvara, the Supreme Lord is Krishna, Ishvara Parama Krishna, he has a Vigraha, a form, which is eternal, full of bliss and knowledge, and Anadir. He has no origin. Again, the same word Adi. And so a beginning, an origin. So something has no origin, it's Anadi. But Adi, it's the origin. So this is basically pure Aristotle, or Aristotle is pure Brahma Samhita. So Krishna is Anadir Adir Govinda, Sarva Karana Karanam, the cause of all causes, literally. So, if you are really inquisitive or philosophical, in other words, you understand that human life gives you this amazing opportunity to figure things out, and you're not going to waste this opportunity, because I personally have never met an intellectual beaver or like a sort of a philosophical dog or something. I mean, they're nice, we love them, but, well, probably dogs more than beavers. But still, we as human beings, we alone on this planet actually have the ability to figure these things out. And one thing about the scientific revolution of the 1600s, which changed the world, not forever, but for the foreseeable future. And that is what you don't learn in science classes, is that the inspiration for the scientific revolution was God. That devotion to God inspired the scientific revolution. And I'll explain that. There are two possibilities for the universe. One is that it's all exactly like in Harry Potter, which means that the universe doesn't obey standard rules. It's like in Harry Potter, if you want to create, let's say, a talking rodent, or, there's a certain thing you say, a certain thing you recite, and then maybe you pour, oak leaves into, mix it with cattails. So it's just, and then if you want to do something else, it's something completely different. So the difference between mysticism and magic is, you have to understand that they're very different things. Harry Potter lived in a magical universe, which means that there aren't like standard laws. It's just like, Newton's great discovery was that the planets stay in orbit for the same reason apples fall down from trees and don't float up from trees. That everything in the universe is obeying exactly the same laws. And so it's a completely rational picture of the universe. In mysticism, it's the same thing. There is a very rational, logical picture of the universe. It's just that it includes certain things that aren't physical, like souls and God. But once you understand what souls are, what God is, it's a completely regular, rational system of cause and effect. In fact, that's one of the great, and so the point I'm getting to is that because, with the Renaissance, the rebirth, that's what it means, that's French, right? Rebirth, renaissance, renacimiento. And so it's a rebirth of what? It's a rebirth of Greco-Roman civilization. And yet, actually, it's very important to understand the Renaissance was a Southern European thing, which was resented by North Europe and led to the Protestant Reformation. But anyways, another topic. So the Renaissance means that people wanted to get back to a more rational, logical, philosophical view of the world, and not just, one-stop shopping. Everything you need to know is in the Bible. It's just like Prabhupada, the first instruction he gave me was study lots of books, stay in the university, so you can have an intelligent conversation with educated people. Prabhupada didn't say, just read my books. Obviously Prabhupada's books are ultimately what it all means, but to present Krishna consciousness to intelligent people, you have to speak intelligently, and that means you have to read books, or at least, go listen to YouTube lectures or something. So when you had the scientific revolution, part of the Renaissance was a revival of what was called back in the ancient times logos philosophy. Logos, from where we get the word logic, and also logos is built into every academic field, almost like geology, physiology, psychology. The logy is just logos. It's the Greek word logos. So back then, the Stoics, other people had this logos philosophy, which is actually got it right. The logos philosophy was the idea that God is not just, angry or jealous or, it's other emotional issues, but God is actually an infinitely rational being. He's also loving, but he's infinitely rational. He's infinitely reasonable. And therefore, and that infinite reason, that infinite intelligence of God was called logos. And because God creates the world also contains this logos. that the world is simply an expression of the mind of God. The world is a manifestation, an expression of the rational mind of God. And therefore, since we are creatures, God also, makes us exist. We have that same logos in us. We have the power of rational intelligence. We have the power to reason. And so therefore, they put all this together and they thought science is possible because the universe is not simply random or erratic, or it's not like, one day apples fall down from trees, the next day they fly up, and then the third day they go sideways. Or maybe they do all those things in the same day. In other words, you can imagine a universe in which there are no laws. Things are just careening, just bouncing all over the place, and you can never figure it out because nothing happens the same way twice. So these early scientists rejected that idea and said we live in a lawful universe because it comes from the rational mind of God. So that's actually what gave them confidence to go out and try to do science. Anyway, and it's true. For example, Krishna says in the Gita, Buddhir Buddhimatam Asmi. I am the rational intelligence of those who have rational intelligence. Because that in Sanskrit, the word for rational intelligence, analytic intelligence, is buddhi. And Krishna describes bhakti yoga as buddhi yoga. In other words, the practice of bhakti yoga is the spiritual practice of reason, of intelligence. We also sing and dance, we all do that. We all love that. But it's also the practice of rational intelligence. And Prabhupada, in his first instruction to me, not only indicated, he just flat out said it, that if you want to persuade intelligent people, you have to present Krishna consciousness intelligently. If you want to attract people who think. So anyway, that's, and so that desire to understand things in a reasonable way is called Brahma Jigyasa. It's the desire to understand the absolute. And actually, at the end of the fourth chapter, Krishna has this whole section in the Gita where he glorifies knowledge. There's nothing so sublime and pure in this world as knowledge. There's this whole section where Krishna just glorifies knowledge. So that's why in ISKCON, we do have temples, where rituals are performed, but we have many more schools. Just joking. So anyway, so that's, we have our Krishna West oddity, and that's one of the main objectives is to, it's not that everyone has to be an intellectual. You can love Krishna and go back to the spiritual world very happily. You don't need to be an intellectual. But if we're actually going to change this planet, we do need to have a significant number of serious devotees of Krishna who can present what we are doing reasonably to intelligent people, because it's just the nature of life that intelligent people tend to have more money and more influence than unintelligent people. And, whether it should be that way, it just is that way. And therefore, if we want to attract, what's the word now? Influencers. If we want to attract people, who, it's just social dynamics. It's called Yukta Vairagya. If we want to succeed in helping to save this poor planet, we have to be capable of strategic planning. If we're incapable of acting strategically, and we just think it'll just happen by itself, Prabhupada rejected that. And that's the famous story where just before Prabhupada left this world, he called Giriraj Swami, one of the great devotees of our moment. He called him to his room in the middle of the night. Prabhupada wasn't sleeping very much, and so Giriraj was wondering, like, why did Prabhupada call me in the middle of the night? This was in Vrindavan. So he went into Prabhupada's room, and he sat there in this, it was a dark room, just there was this one candle lit near Prabhupada. And then Prabhupada called him up, indicated he should come. And Prabhupada sort of whispered, he could only sort of whisper then because his body was getting weaker. And so he sort of whispered in Giriraj's ear, when I leave, will this movement go on? And interestingly, Giriraj, as he himself explained it to me, kind of gave the stock answer, like, he said what you're supposed to say. Yes, Prabhupada, if we chant Hare Krishna and follow the principles, which is kind of like Bhakti Mimamsa, it'll happen automatically if you just follow the principles. And Prabhupada indicated, no, it's not enough. He said there must be intelligence. That's what he said. There must be intelligence and organization. So here we are on good old planet Earth, and we should use our God-given intelligence strategically. How do you bring Krishna consciousness to a community, to a region, to a country? We should actually have a reasonable plan of how that can actually be done. And the spirit of Yukta Vairagya, that involves knowing something about how the world works in terms of social science and other things. Not that you have to be a big intellectual to spread the movement, but I think I think we need to go beyond the Bhakti Mimamsa. It's kind of a term, sarcastic term I coined. That's what I do to amuse myself. I coin sarcastic terms. Anyway, so this is an analogy to what Prabhupada described, and actually what history describes as Karma Mimamsa. This was a group of philosophers. I actually took a course on them at Harvard. We had actually a whole course on Karma Mimamsa people. And I found out they're actually worse than I thought. But anyway, Karma Mimamsa means that you believe that the basic reality of the universe is that it's a mechanism. The universe is basically a mechanism. And if you figure out how the big machine works, you don't need things like devotion or love or, like, for example, let's say someone knows how to build an engine. Someone knows how to, and they build one. It's irrelevant, whether the person is a nice person or not a nice person, the person, loves God or doesn't love God. You just know how to build an engine, so you build one and it works. Or you know how to build a house. So that's Karma Mimamsa, that the universe is a mechanism, and the owner's manual is called the Vedas. The Vedas are just the owner's manual, like, the universe for dummies or something. And so you read the Vedas, you perform certain sacrifices because the sacrifices have vibrations, and the vibrations sort of, cause things to happen in the universe. In fact, if you want to know how the Vedic sacrifices actually worked, when you did, like, let's say, big sacrifices, not just sort of a domestic Agnihotra, but you did these big sacrifices, there were actually different fires. There were actually three fires. There was the fire, the earth fire, there was the heaven Swarga fire, and there was the fire for the forefathers. And so these fires were actually portals, because Agni is a god. And Agni actually, I guess, Mercury in Greek mythology, and so Agni actually transports things, because Agni is a fire in your little, your little earthly fire sacrifice, but he's also in higher planets at the same time. And therefore, when you offer things into the fire, they can actually go through that portal to higher worlds. And the way to think about these three fires, it's very much like a very sophisticated computer screen. They're icons. The fires are actually icons in modern language. And so when you pour the ghee into the fire, you're clicking on the icon. And ultimately what makes all this work is Vishnu. It said Yagyo vai Vishnu. Indeed, the sacrifice is Vishnu. Because, think about one simple fact, which Krishna explains in the Gita several times, and that is everything is in him, and he is in everything. So because Krishna is within everything, and everything is within him, the logical conclusion is that everything is everywhere. Actually, everything is everywhere because of Vishnu. And therefore, in the sacrifice, if you understand that ultimately the fire, Agni is just standing in for Vishnu, then everything's everywhere. Then you can access any part of the universe and do all kinds of interesting things. Now, if you talk about the oldest Veda in terms of linguistic analysis, just like if you understand the history of English, you know that Shakespeare is older than Harry Potter because you just look at the language. And Chaucer is older than Shakespeare. The Canterbury Tales are like Cervantes. So by linguistic analysis, you can tell that some books are older than other books. Some language is older, and you can. It's called historical linguistics. So by linguistic analysis, among the four Vedas, the oldest one is the Rig Veda. And the names of the four Vedas actually tell what they are. Rig in Sanskrit, or Rig means hymn. So it's the hymn book, all these powerful hymns. And the Yajur Veda, Yajur means sort of like sacrificial instructions and explanations. So the Yajur Veda is exactly that. That's what's in it. And so on. So anyway, so in the Rig Veda, the oldest commentary by far, not a word for word or verse by verse commentary, but just telling basically what it means, what it's about, is called the Aitareya Brahmana. So in terms of chronology, you have these Samhitas, which just means collection, literally putting things together. Sang is together, Hita means placing. So like anthologies or collections. And this is in the Bhagavatam, by the way. It's actually in the Bhagavatam twice. It's in the 12th canto, I believe, and it's also definitely in the first canto. It's actually in the first canto and the last canto. It describes how when Vyasa divided the Vedas, because it used to be there was just one big literature which had the hymns and the instructions and how to chant, which is the Sama Veda, and kind of like the Vedic voodoo and the Atharva Veda. So it used to be, it was all just one big book. So when it said, and the word Vyasa means the divider. It's actually a title, it's not his name. So because asa means placing, and V means apart, which if you know Italian, they say like go away, they say via. And so it comes through Latin into Italian. So V means apart. V is the opposite of sum. Sum means together, V means apart. So therefore, you have samasa, putting things together, and vyasa, putting things apart. So because Vyasa divided the Veda, he said, okay, I'm going to take all the hymns and put them in one book. I'm going to take all the sacrificial instructions and meanings and put them in another book called the Yajur Veda, and so on. So that's what Vyasa did. But then, how did the Veda come down to us? Because it wasn't written. I mean, I've explained this many times, but there's absolutely zero evidence anywhere in the Bhagavatam or the Mahabharata that people wrote 5,000 years ago. It was an oral society. And things like, Rukmini sent Krishna a letter, Nope. She actually sent him an oral message. If you read the Bhagavatam, it's just right there. And that nice story about Vyasa dictating to Ganesh, who wrote it down, that's a very nice Hindu story, which is not actually in the Mahabharata. So, and also in terms of, because people were very bright back then, they had, I mean, powers of memory that we can't even imagine. So, and if you look at material scholarship, the first writing, the first evidence that someone actually wrote something in India is about roughly, let's say, 2400 years ago, which are the edicts of Ashoka. Anyway, so Vyasa, the Bhagavatam explains actually more than once that in order to preserve the Vedas intact, he gave each Veda to a sage. And that's all described in the first canto and the 12th canto, like the Rig Veda was given to Pila and so on. And the Tara Veda was given to Samantu. So, and then there were Brahmin communities, and these different Brahmin communities were the preservers and the protectors, the guardians of the different Vedas. And so those, and this is all in the Bhagavatam. So those communities, those, very elevated, very highly intelligent communities they composed commentaries on their respective Vedas. And those commentaries are called the Brahmin literature. So if you look at a little chart of the chronology of Vedic literature, you have the Samhitas, and then you have the Brahmin literature. So the point I'm getting to, and then from there, of course, then you get Aranyaka literature, where people don't just want to do rituals, they want philosophy and knowledge, and so they go to the forest, Aranya, and they produce literature called Aranyaka, and from that comes the Upanishads. In any case, each Brahmin community, these 4 Brahmin communities that came down through time, extremely conservative, memorizing, preserving their respective Vedas, and they composed commentaries to explain what their Vedas meant. So here's the point I was getting to. The oldest Veda, Rig Veda, because the hymns are just go back forever. And it's actually, it's Sanskrit, but it's a different form of Sanskrit. It's called Vedic. In fact, there are books of Sanskrit grammar and there are books of Vedic grammar. There are actually books of Vedic grammar. And it's the same. It's kind of like Old English, and it's almost like if you're reading Shakespeare and then you wanted to read modern English. So anyway, the oldest commentary on the Rig Veda, the oldest commentary you should go on the screen, Panchali, say literally.
Thank you.
The oldest commentary on the oldest Veda is called the Aitareya Brahmana, named after the sage Atri. And the very first verse, because it's like 1.1.1.1.1, because it's a big word. So the very first statement is, of all the gods, Vishnu is the highest. Actually, and Agni is the lowest, because Agni actually has to eat stuff on earth. So that was kind of for the god. That was kind of like, ew. So, earthly food. So anyway, so Agni, instead of all the gods, the lowest is Agni, the highest is Vishnu. So the idea that Vishnu is the highest is the very first statement of the oldest commentary of the oldest Veda. I mentioned that actually to my main professor at Harvard, who's a very famous scholar of the Vedas, and he said, yeah, that's right. In other words, he didn't try to problematize it and say, yeah, but. There was no yeah, but. It was just, yeah, that's right. So anyway, yes, questions. We'll take questions.
Thank you. What was the name of that book? Aitareya?
Aitareya.
Aitareya.
Aitareya. Aitareya. From the sage Atri. Any other question?
Death.
Yes.
we have control of how it happens to ourselves through our activity.
Well, yeah, I mean, Krishna explains in chapter 8 of the Gita that very advanced yogis can choose their time of departure.
And how about how we die? We have, like, what we do while we're here has something to do with how we end up dying.
Okay, let's go into that's called eschatology, like what happens when you die. Okay, first of all, the only place in the Gita where Krishna mentions people actually choosing the time and place of their leaving, their manner, you could say, is in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 8, where and Krishna says there's an Uttarayana and a Dakshinayana. Uttara means in this case northern, and Dakshina means southern. And so, as you know, from the spring equinox until the summer solstice. No, I'm sorry. From the winter solstice until the vernal equinox, the sun is going higher and higher in the sky. Many astronomers can give you all the math for this. So that's why, for example, in the like in Ashland, for example, because it's relatively high latitude, the sun, when it rises, the sun's arc through the sky is getting lower and lower. So there's more and more shade. And so Krishna says that if you leave this world in Uttarayana, Ayana means going or path. And so in the northern path, which means the sun is climbing to the north. This, of course, obviously is northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. Which would be again from the, because the days are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And then you have the vernal solstice, like the shortest days of the year. And that's why they chose to make Christmas on the pagan holiday for the time when the sun starts to go higher in the sky. So from that time, which is, around the end of our year, when the sun starts to climb higher in the sky up until its highest point, which is at the summer solstice, and then it starts to go down again. So if you leave during those 6 months, you don't come back to this world. But if you leave in the Dakshinai, the southern path, when the sun is going lower, then you have to come back. Of course, that's extremely technical, and no one, hardly anyone on earth that can still do that. It's very technical. So Krishna says something else about dying, and not about choosing the way. Obviously, if someone kills himself, they choose the manner of their dying, but that's not a good idea, because it's vandalism. Because actually the body doesn't belong to us. The body was given to us to use, so you shouldn't vandalize the body. So Krishna in chapter 8, the same chapter 8 actually, where he says that what you remember at the time of death will lead you to your next birth. And I think it's very important to mention here that Krishna is not talking about something that a lot of people misinterpret this to think that, at the very last moment of my life, if I say like, oh God, like in the Gandhi movie or something, then I'll go to, no, it's not that just whatever you happen to say as you're leaving the body. What Krishna actually says is, yang vapi smaran bhavam, tyajati ante kalevaram, tattariveti konteya sadata bhava bhavita. It's like whatever state of consciousness you were cultivating throughout your life. Like devotees, when a devotee's leaving, everyone gathers around, whispers Krishna in their ear. And that's very nice. It's a nice thing to do. But ultimately, what you really get at the end of your life is what you deserve. And what you deserve is just the way you led your life and what were you thinking about all your life. And so you can't cheat. You can't live a materialistic life and then just as you leave this world say Hare Krishna. It's not exactly like that. Krishna says, Sadata Bhava Bhavita. It's the state of consciousness you were always cultivating. So the best thing you can do to guarantee yourself a great next life is, advance as far as you can in spiritual consciousness. That's the only real guarantee we have. Yes.
It reminds me of Jamil, who lived a very hedonistic life, and at the very end, he simply chanted then he would not.
Yes, but that's because in his youth he had really gotten a lot of spiritual merit.
It's not
Very few.
And Krishna
It's not
says,
emphasized that he's in his youth. It's not. Never,
I know, because people use that story to promote a wrong idea, which is that you don't need any qualification, just say Hare Krishna, which is actually not what Krishna teaches. So the Ajamila story doesn't prove Agyata Sukriti, which is not even really a term you find in the Bhagavatam Gita. But it actually demonstrates what Krishna says in chapter 2, where he says, Neha vikramanashosti. In this practice of bhakti yoga, na iha ne abhikramanasho, your endeavor is never lost. Pratyabhayo navidyate, and you never lose. There's never loss. You never lose what you've accumulated. It's always in your spiritual bank account. So that's what the Ajamila story actually demonstrates.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I've always had this curiosity to really understand, the Shastras, they say that the soul is kind of dormant and completely oblivious of all actions, right? But then
Not exactly.
Then how are we
Yeah.
questioning and
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. What you suspected is true, that you were told something wrong. I mean, because the analogy is it's like sleeping, but when you sleep, you dream. And your dreams are based on the real world. Like when you dream, you basically it's just made up of all the elements of the real world. Maybe, put in a different order or something. So what Krishna actually uses a word in the Gita over and over again to explain what conditioned consciousness really is. And the word he uses is avrita, covered. And obviously if it was a complete covering, you would be unconscious. So this body is filtering our consciousness. So you're very much awake and conscious. And so is everybody else. Well, most people. So that, let's say, when I was a young brahmachari, I was given this analogy, which I used a lot. I thought it was so good. If you take traffic lights, you get red, yellow, and green light. But actually behind those coverings, it's all the same light. But when consciousness passes through a red screen, it comes out red or yellow or green. So in the same way, when your pure consciousness comes through a baby body, you experience baby consciousness or girl consciousness or adolescent or woman or whatever. So consciousness is being filtered through the body. And that's precisely why the fifth stage of yoga, pratyahara, means literally reverse perception. In other words, because consciousness is going out into the world to experience the world, but in doing so, it's going through the body and it's being filtered by the body. Male consciousness, female consciousness, young consciousness, old consciousness, animal consciousness, bird, human, because it just depends on what filter it passes through. But pratyahara means that instead of letting consciousness go through all these filters, prati means reverse, actually, among other things in Sanskrit. It has several meanings. So it means that you pull your consciousness back inside. You reverse the flow of consciousness. So the consciousness is going in and you experience your unfiltered self. And that's what the whole yoga thing is. You experience your unfiltered self as a pure soul. And because we're not used to doing that, it's like, because we were so conditioned that consciousness goes out through the filters to look for enjoyable sounds, sights, aromas, and everything else, that when you first bring the consciousness back to the self, you've got to really hang on. And therefore, the next step it means hanging on, dharana. That's what the word means. It means like hang on. because even though it's ultimately natural for the pure soul, it's not natural for the conditioned soul. And as soon as you bring your consciousness within, it wants to bounce back out. And therefore, dharana, just hang on there and keep your consciousness within. And if you can hold it there, then you do dhyana, then you can meditate. But you can't meditate unless you first bring the consciousness in and hold it there. And of course, when your meditation becomes mature, then it's samadhi. Samadhi, of course, I always explain, is made of 3 elements. Samadhi. Sam means same as Sankirtan. So sam can mean together, like together kirtan, Sankirtan, but it also means together in the sense of complete or consummate. Because if everything's together, it's complete. And so is it means within, an intensifier, the long A's, and then D means placing. So placing consciousness completely and intensely on the right object. That's samadhi.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's fun. Sanskrit. So
Yeah, this is really good because I've heard classes where they say the soul is completely
knocked out.
unaware
Yeah.
of anything external, but then I can't understand. But so then who is praying and who is
Exactly. Yeah.
questioning who am I? Why? Am I?
Exactly. No, you're right. Because if you think about it, if the soul is just sleeping, that would lead to a completely absurd conclusion, which is that dead matter can be conscious.
Right.
Because if it's not your consciousness, and Krishna totally rejects that, because Krishna says in the Gita, where he says, Bhumi Rapo Nalo Vayu, earth, water, fire, air, this is my Bina Prakriti, my separated energy. Why separate? Because it's dead and unconscious. And then he says, Apara Iyam. Apara means inferior, like para means higher. Iyam is a feminine this, because he's talking about Prakriti, which is a feminine word. All the Sanskrit nouns formed with ti are feminine words like bhakti, shruti, shakti, all those words. That's you form a feminine noun in Sanskrit with that T ending. So shruti, smriti, all those words. So Krishna says iyam, talking about the prakriti, the material energy. He says this iyam is apara, inferior, lower. Aparayam itas, but beyond this inferior energy, ita means beyond that. Prakritim vidhi me param. Know that there is a superior prakriti. Aparayam, this is inferior, but beyond this, know that there's a higher prakriti. So aparayam ita swanyam prakritim vidhi me, it's an energy of mind, param, and it's higher. And that is jiva bhuta. So when it's literally the living being, jiva bhuta. So therefore, what makes us superior is that we're alive and we're conscious. And so to say that dead matter is conscious is to get everything totally nutso. Because dead matter is not consciousness. Dead matter can only filter consciousness. It cannot be conscious. Because if it wasn't your consciousness, when you make decisions like to be nice to someone, to be unkind to someone, that's unconsciously. And if it's not your consciousness, how could you get the karma? Because if you're just sleeping, it means you didn't choose to do anything. If you didn't choose to do anything, you didn't get any karma. So the whole thing is just completely absurd. It's an absurd idea. So it's you in there, and you're pretty unfiltered. So it's he's the soul. So it's you in there, and and what strengthens the filter so the consciousness gets skewed? Attachment. Because it's precisely because I'm attached to my body. Oh, it's getting harder and harder at my age, but it's precisely, like in real estate, I'm highly motivated not to identify with my body now. every time I see a picture, I become very highly motivated not to identify with that. So when if I'm attached to my body, then the filter becomes powerful. And if I'm detached from the body, then my consciousness can just pass through the body, through seeing, hearing, and thinking, without getting really skewed or filtered. So a pure soul like Prabhupada uses the senses, uses the external apparatus, but his pure consciousness is not being filtered because he's not attached to it. Because the connection between the soul and the body is not physical, because the soul is not physical. The connection is psychological, not physical. You can't have a physical connection between a physical thing and a non-physical thing. So the connection is actually merely psychological. But when you cleanse your psychology, then you're, in that sense, you're in the body, but you're not really psychologically connected to it in that way. And therefore, consciousness can move through the body without being filtered. And that's why it's in that sense that the best yogis actually go out into the world to try to help other souls. And they can do so without being affected. I mean, I was with Prabhupada, he was just like totally. I mean, for Prabhupada, I mean, to use kind of like somewhat crude language, I mean, the whole material world was just like a really terrible date. I mean, in the sense that, you go out with someone, but there's just like no connection, there's no attachment, you just keep looking at your watch. So, and that's what this world is, it's just a really bad date. So because Prabhupada was pure, his conscience was not filtered. So that's clear, isn't it? Any other question? If not, we can do it. Hare Krishnas do best and serve prasadam. Oh, I have to thank my dear sister, Brenda. She's like my real spiritual sister. For kind of making all this happen. And of course, I want to thank all of you for hosting me in different ways and helping and for coming, for showing up and saving me from a Vedic depression. No one showed up. So yeah, so thank you all very much.
I just said yes to your request to come and be with us. So
And you did a few things too.
just a few.
Just a few.
So did everyone else. So
Yes,
thank
yes.
you.
I want to thank everyone. So it's really great to see everybody. It's like when you travel and preach and Krishna consciousness, like every day is a high school reunion. So thank you all. And so Panchali, we'll and thanks to everyone who's watching at a distance. Appreciate your attending. Hare Krishna, and thanks to Panchali who made all this digital stuff happen. There she is.